Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture on labor supply. Each of us must decide whether to work and once employed, how many hours to work. At any point in time, the economy wide labor supply is given by adding the work choices by the individuals. However, the total labor supply in the economy depends on the fertility decision made by earlier generation, which determines the size of current population, and the economic and social consequences of these decisions vary dramatically over time. As you can see, the one child norm of China, now they have come out of this norm, this policy. So, you can see the consequences, social consequences and economic consequences. In this lecture, we will discuss the framework that economists use to study labor supply decisions of the individuals. In this framework, individuals seeks to maximize their well-being by consuming both goods and leisure. Goods have to be purchased in the marketplace because most of us are not independently wealthy. So, we must work in order to earn the cash required to buy the desired goods. So, the economic trade-off is clear. If you do not work, you can consume a lot of leisure, but you have to do without the goods and services that make life more enjoyable. If you work, then you will be able to afford many of these goods and services, but you must give up some of your valuable leisure time. So, before getting into the detailed discussion, let us recall how we measure the labor supply in the economy. So, the size of the labor force in the economy contains the employed and the unemployed people, and the labor force participation rate is the ratio between the labor force participation and the population, whereas the employment rate is the number of employed by the divided by the number of population, and the unemployment rate is the unemployed number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. And this labor force is having so many socio-economic and demographic characteristics. This labor force is divided across the caste, class, religion, different sectors, rural, urban. So, individuals across these socio-economic demographic characteristics, they supply their labor hour to the economy. The framework that economists typically use to analyze the supply behavior is called the neoclassical model of labor leisure choice. This model isolates the factors that determine whether a particular person works, and if so, how many hours he or she chooses to work. So, by isolating these key factors, we can tell a simple story that explains and helps us to understand many of the stylized factors about the size of the labor force in the economy. More important is that the theory allows us to predict how changes in the economic conditions or in the government policies will attract or affect work incentives among the individuals. Here, we have considered this neoclassical model of labor leisure choice. The individual have to get certain utilities by consuming both goods and services and leisure together. So, utility of an individual is a function of both consumption of goods and services and leisure. So, in this model, an individual receives satisfaction from both consumption of goods, which we have denoted as C, and the consumption of leisure, which we denoted as L. Obviously, the person consumes many different types of goods during any given time period. To simplify the matters, we aggregate the value of all the goods that the person consumes in terms of money. Here we have taken the dollar and define C as the total dollar value of all the goods that the person purchased during the period. For example, if the person spends $1,000 weekly on food, rent, car payments, movie tickets and many other items, the value C would be take on the value of $1,000. The variable L gives the number of hours of leisure that a person consumes during the same time period. So, the utility function, it transforms the person's consumption of goods and leisure into an index which we have denoted as U. This index measures the individual's level of satisfaction or happiness, and this index called utility. So, higher the level of U, the higher the person happier, the more the person is happier. Here we make the sensible assumption that buying more goods or having more leisure hours both increases the person's utility. Well, in the jargon of economics, both this C and L are the goods, not bads. Suppose that a person is consuming, let us say, $500 worth of consumption goods and 100 hours of leisure weekly, which you can see the point Y in the figure. This particular consumption basket yields a particular level of utility to the person, let us say 25,000 utils. So, it is easy to imagine that different combination of consumption goods and hours of leisure might yield the same level of utility. When you see point Y and point X, the person might say that she would be indifferent in consuming $500 worth of goods and 100 hours of leisure at point Y, or consuming 400 worth of goods and 120 hours of leisure at point X. So, both these points are giving him same level of utility. It is explained in the figure that many combination of these C and L that generates this particular level of utility. The position of such points called an indifference curve, and all the points along the indifference curve have the same utility, 25,000 utils. Now, suppose the person were interested in consuming $450 worth of goods and 150 hours of leisure, let us say the point Z. This consumption basket would put the person on a higher indifference curve, yielding 40,000 utils. So, we can then construct an indifference curve for this level of utility, 40,000 utils. In fact, we can construct an indifference curve for every level of utility. So, as a result, the utility function can be represented graphically in terms of a family of indifference curve or a map of indifference curves. So, now let us discuss the properties of this indifference curves. The indifference curves are downward sloping. As you can see, as I said, indifference curves are downward sloping. We assume that individuals prefer more of both C and L. If indifference curves were upward sloping, then what would happen? In that case, a consumption basket with more C and L would yield the same level of utility as a consumption basket with less C and less L. This clearly contradicts our assumption that the individual like both goods and leisure. So, the only way that we can offer a person few more hours of leisure and still hold the utility constant is to take away some of the goods and services which he consumes. So, therefore, the indifference curves are downward sloping. Second, higher indifference curves indicate higher utility level, which means the consumption bundles lying on the indifference curve that yields 40,000 utils are preferred to the bundle lying on the curve that yields 25,000 utils. To see this, note that the point Z in the figure must yield more utility than the point X, simply because the bundle at point Z allows the person to consume more of goods and leisure as compared to the point X. Further, the indifference curves, they do not intersect. To see why indifference curves do not intersect, look at the figure where the indifference curves are allowed to intersect, because points X and Y lies on the same indifference curve. The individual would be indifferent between the bundle of X and Y. Further, because points Y and Z lies on the same indifference curve, the individual would be indifferent between bundles Y and Z. Now, the person would then be indifferent between X and Y and between Y and Z, so that she would also be indifferent between X and Z. But Z is clearly preferable to X because Z has more goods and more leisure. So, indifference curves that intersect contradicts our assumption that individuals like consume both goods and leisure. The next property is that the indifference curves are convex to the origin. While we are saying the indifference curves are convex to the origin, the convexity of the indifference curves does not follow from either the definition of the indifference curve or the assumption that both goods and leisure are goods. The convexity reflects an additional assumption about the shape of the utility function. It turns out that indifference curves must be convex to the origin if we are ever to observe a person sharing her time between work and leisure activities. So, let us try to understand what will be the slope of this indifference curve. Before trying to understand what will be the slope of this indifference curve, let us try to understand the concept of marginal utility. What happens to a person's utility as she allocates one more hour of leisure or buys an additional dollar of goods and services? Here, the marginal utility of leisure is defined as the change in the utility resulting from an additional hour devoted to the leisure activities, holding constant the amount of goods consumed. So, we denote the marginal utility of leisure as mu subscript L. Similarly, we can define the marginal utility of consumption as the change in the utility if the individual consumes one more dollar of goods, holding constant the number of hours devoted to the leisure activity. We denote the marginal utility of consumption by mu subscript C. because we have assumed that both leisure and consumption of goods are desirable activities. The marginal utilities of leisure and consumption must be positive number. So, the absolute value of the slope of an indifference curve, which is called the marginal rate of substitution between consumption and the leisure. It is the ratio of the marginal utilities of both this consumption and leisure. As you can see, when you move from this point y to x on this graph, what exactly happening when you are moving from this point y to x? You are substituting some amount of consumption in order to have some amount of leisure. So, the assumption that indifference curves are convex to the origin is essentially an assumption about how the marginal rate of substitution changes as the person moves along the indifference curve. The convexity implies that the slope of the indifference curve is steeper when the worker is consuming a lot of goods and little of leisure, and that the curve is flatter when the worker is consume few goods and a lot of leisure. As a result, the absolute value of the slope of an indifference curve declines as the person roll down the curve. So, the assumption of convexity therefore is equivalent to an assumption of diminishing marginal rate of substitution. So, the rate of substitution declines as the individual moves on this indifference curve towards the down. Further, the shape of the indifference curve will be different for different individuals because they have difference in the preference towards consuming this goods and services and leisure. As you can see in this graph, for worker A, the indifference curves are relatively stiff. For worker B, the indifference curves are relatively flat, which means the worker A prefers more leisure, whereas the worker B prefers more work. This is the inference which we can draw from the indifference curves of these individual workers, because different workers will typically view this trade-off differently. In other words, some persons may like to devote more time and effort to their jobs, whereas other persons would prefer to devote most of their time to leisure. These interpersonal differences in preferences imply that indifference curves may look quite different for different workers. So, for worker A, we are having the indifference curve which are much steeper. For worker B, we are having the indifference curve which are much flatter. A's indifference curve tends to be very stiff, as I said, which indicates that her marginal rate of substitution takes a very high value. In other words, she requires a sizable monetary bribe in terms of additional consumption to convince her to give up an additional hour of leisure. So, worker A obviously likes leisure, she likes it a lot, whereas worker B on the other hand has a flatter indifference curve, indicating that her marginal rate of substitution takes on a low value. Therefore, worker B does not require a large bribe to convince her to give up an additional hour of leisure. These interpersonal differences in the tastes of work are obviously important determinants of differences in the labor supply in the population. Workers who work like leisure a lot, like the worker A, will tend to work few hours, and the worker who do not attach a high value to their leisure time like worker B will tend to be a workaholic. This interpersonal differences in the tests provides an easy way out for anyone who wishes to explain why different workers behave differently. We all see in our day to day life, all the workers they do not work in the same way. After all, one could simply argue that different behavior patterns between any two workers arise because worker A likes more leisure than worker B, and there would be no way of proving whether such statements is correct or not. Economic models instead stress the impact of the variables that are much more easily observable, such as wage, income, and the labor supply decision, because these variables can be observed and measured. So, the predictions made by the models about which type of persons will tend to work more are testable and refutable. So, these things can be tested taking some variables like wage and income with relation to their labor supply. The person's consumption of goods and leisure is constrained by her time and also by her income. Let us discuss about the constraint faced by the individual while supplying his labor hour. So, each individual faces a constraint of time and income in order to consume certain goods and services. So, we define it as a budget constraint. As I said, the person's consumption of goods and leisure is constrained by her time and by her income. However, part of the person's income such as property income, dividends, lottery prizes is independent of how many hours she works. So, this is a kind of non-labor income. We denote this non-labor income by V. Let H be the number of hours the person will allocate to the labor market during the period, and W be the hourly wages he is going to get by working in the labor market. So, the person's budget constraint can be written as C equals to W H, number of hours he work in the labor market, multiplied by the per hour wage rate, plus V is the non-labor income. Given the assumption of a constant wage rate, it is easy to plot the budget constraint. The person has two alternative uses of a time, work or leisure. So, the total time allocated to each of these activities must be equal to the total time available to the individual in that particular time period. Let us say T is the hours per week, which is the total time available to the individual, and he has to spend this total time either working in the labor market or having leisure. So, the total time can be written as H plus L. So, we can write this budget constraint that C equals to W whole into T minus L. T is the total time available weekly minus the leisure hour plus the non labor income. If we rewrite this, then this is the budget constraint is C equals to W t plus B minus W L. So, you can see the slope of the uh, budget constraint is minus W. If you look at the graph, the point E in the graph indicates that if the person does not to work at all and devotes T hours to the leisure activities, she can still purchase V dollars worth of consumption of goods and services. So, point E is the endowment point. Even if he is not working, he can consume certain amount of goods and services from his non-labor income. If the person is willing to give up 1 hour of leisure, she can then move up the budget line and purchase an additional W dollars of worth of goods and services. In fact, each additional hour of leisure that the person is going to give up allows her to buy an additional W dollar of worth of goods. So, in other words, each hour of leisure consumed has a price and the price is given by the wage rate. If the worker gives up all her leisure activities, then she ends up at the intercept the budget line and can buy WT plus V dollar worth of goods. The consumption and leisure bundles that lie below this budget line are available to the worker, and the bundles that are above the budget line are not available to the workers. He cannot afford to have any combination of this C and L which lies above this budget line. So, the budget line therefore is the frontier of the worker's opportunity, the set of all the consumption baskets that a particular worker can afford to buy. So, this is called the opportunity set. This is the worker's opportunity set. So, as you can see in the graph, if the worker is not going to work, he can consume certain amount of goods and services from his non-labor income, and he enjoys all the time available to him as leisure. As he moves into the labor market or he is going to do the trade off, he enters into this point, and if he spends his entire time which is available to him to work in the labor market, he can consume WT plus V amount of goods and services. So, this plus this. So, now this is his opportunity set. Any point below this line or on this line is affordable. Any point above this point is not affordable. So, this point is called the endowment point. If we make one important assumption about the person's behavior, she wishes to choose the particular combination of goods and leisure that maximize her utility. This means the person will choose the level of goods and leisure that leads to the highest possible level of the utility given the limitations imposed by this budget constraint. So, let us try to understand when we superimpose this budget constraint on the level of utilities which are available to the individual worker. Let us say that the total number of T which is available to the worker in a particular week is 110 hours, excluding this sleeping hour. So, this is 110 is the non sleeping hour per week is available to the individual. He can either work or he can have leisure with this 110 hours per week. Let us assume that the available wage rate is $10 and the non labor income which is available to the particular individual is $100. Now, with this we can draw the budget constraint for that individual. With this $100 of non labor income, the worker is at this point E is his endowment point, and if the worker is going to work for his entire time which is available to him, then he can have a point here, point F, by spending all his entire hours available for that week, which is plus this 100 non labor income. So, he can consume $1,200 worth of goods and services by at this point F. Now, this is his opportunity set. Now, he is having so many utility functions. Now, he has to maximize his utility. He has to maximize the consumption of goods and services and leisure in such a way that he can maximize his utility function. He can derive the maximum satisfaction. Now, if you look at this graph, the point P is the point which lies on the utility function u star. This is the tangent point. The slope of this utility function equals to the slope of the budget constant, and having the point P, the now worker is consuming 500 units of consumption and having a leisure of 70 hours, or the work hour is 40 hours. So, by working 40 hours in the labor market with a wage rate of 10, he is getting $400 as the earned income, plus he is having the non labor income is 100. So, total amount of goods and services he consume having at point P is $500 and working for 40 hours and having a leisure of 70 hours. Any point other than this P, let us say point Y, the worker would be happy to be at point Y on this indifference curve or a higher utility function U1, but it is not affordable with this level of non labor income and with this level of wage rate. While comparing the point P with point A, you can see that point A lies on a lower indifference curve, which means having point A is going to give him a less level of satisfaction as compared to point P. So, point P is much better off at the point P as compared to point A. So, while interpreting this tangency condition, the equilibrium condition, the utility maximizing condition of the individual, it is nothing but the slope of this budget constant must be equals to the slope of the indifference curve. The indifference curve, the slope is nothing but it is the marginal rate of substitution between leisure and consumption. So, how we interpret this tangency condition? At the chosen level of consumption and leisure, the point P, it is the marginal rate of substitution. Marginal rate of substitution is nothing but the rate at which the person is willing to give up leisure hours in exchange for the additional consumption, must be equal to the wage rate. The wage rate is nothing but the rate at which the market allows the worker to substitute 1 hour of leisure time for consumption. The quantity, the marginal utility L, gives the additional utility received from the consuming an extra hour of leisure. This extra hour of leisure costs W dollar. So, the left hand side of the equation is therefore gives the number of the utils received from the spending an additional dollar on leisure. Because this consumption C is defined as the dollar value of expenditure on consumption goods. So, the MUC, marginal utility of consumption, gives the number of utils received from the spending on additional dollar on consumption. The tangency solution at point P in the figure implies that the last dollar spent on leisure activities buys the same number of utils as the last dollar spent on consumption of goods. If this equality did not hold, the workers would not be maximizing utility. So, the individual could rearrange her consumption plan so as to purchase more of the commodity that yields more utility for last dollar. In next lecture, we will discuss about the labor supply. What happens to the hours, the work hours decision when there changes happens to the non-labor income, to the wages, what happens to the workers' preference, how the individuals they take decisions whether to work or not to work. Thank you.